Matt Schaff and Jared Smola of DraftSharks.com here to prep you for your Week 9 waiver wire runs. And spoiler alert, folks, it's probably not a great week to work the waiver wire. You can do a quick Google search, and you're going to find a good bit of the first wide receiver we'll discuss on this show, who's going to be interesting. Bo Nix, which is understandable coming off of this past week. And then Keon Coleman was a name that popped up a bunch for me, Jared, which surprised me. At first, I was like, oh, maybe that's somebody we should be talking about. And then I checked. 63% rostered on Sleeper, 73% rostered on CBS, a little bit lower on Yahoo. So I'm sure there are some people for whom he's available coming off of 2 pretty good games. But that to me says that it's a bit thin as a week if Keon Coleman has become like a focal player for people doing their waiver wire stuff.
For sure, yeah. And, if we're not going to talk about Coleman much here today, but if he is available, I'd have him right there with Cedric Tillman as the top waiver ad for this week.
And there you go. Cedric Tillman is the first guy we're going to talk about. Among Browns receivers, we're going to have to talk about this whole group, but Cedric Tillman is obviously the biggest one. If you're watching or listening to this, you probably already know he had 7 catches, 99 yards, 2 touchdowns in the win against Baltimore. Jared, I think even more important than that, though, is his role. He has jumped right over Elijah Moore with Amari Cooper's departure, taken over that role, getting a lot of targets. And of course, Jameis Winston flew in last week on golden wings to save the whole passing game.
Yeah, Tillman's beating Elijah Moore in playing time. And, so far he's beat Jerry Jeudy in targets in these last 2 games, 23 and 22% target shares for Cedric Tillman these last 2 weeks. And he's playing well. I mean, you watch the games. He was really impressive against Baltimore. You look at Pro Football Focus receiving grades. Tillman is 25th among 92 qualifying wide receivers over the last 2 weeks. Playing well, getting volume, you can't really ask for much else. The biggest concern for all these guys is Cleveland's schedule. According to our adjusted fantasy points allowed numbers, they have the second hardest schedule for both quarterbacks and wide receivers the rest of the way. So, that's kind of the cold water on all these guys. But again, I think Tillman, you just look at the volume, and he's someone I think that can at least be a wide receiver 3 for fantasy teams going forward.
Yeah, and I agree that that's something that you need to factor in. I worry more about it for quarterback than for wide receiver, because if Cleveland, struggles over the second half of the season, they're probably going to be averaging like 40 pass attempts a game. And in that case, a wide receiver can have a bad game, especially versus the production he's had the past 2 weeks, and still have lines of like 6 catches for 60 yards and be quite useful for PPR. So very interested in Cedric Tillman going forward. I would say if you have a wide receiver need, then he is well worth betting on at this point. Doesn't mean he's going to hit the rest of the way, but he's worth betting on based on what we've seen these past 2 weeks. Elijah Moore had a team high 12 targets in that game against Baltimore, caught 8 of them for 85 yards. That followed a 6-catch game against Cincinnati. So does that make him a pickup this week, Jared?
It does. Yeah. I mean, Tillman's ahead of Elijah Moore for me in priority. And honestly, we're going to talk about Jerry Jeudy next. I still prefer Jeudy to Elijah Moore the rest of the way. Elijah Moore still basically only playing in 3 wide receiver sets. And what that means is his, route rate is around 70 to 75%, where you have Cedric Tillman and Jerry Jeudy on the field for 90 to 100% of pass play. So that matters. Personally, I've been burned so many times by Elijah Moore. It's hard to put that aside, but yet look at his career. This might be the best passing game he's been a part of in his career so far, right? He was on a lot of bad Jets passing games. He was on bad Browns passing games. So just from a raw production standpoint, as far as, passing yards and touchdowns, this might be the best situation he's been in. So again, he'd be down the list for me, but I think more in deeper leagues, especially PPR leagues, is someone that definitely could be an asset the rest of the way.
I don't think that any of that is wrong, but I am not interested because we still also have David Njoku to get targets here. We have Nick Chubb probably running the ball more going forward than he has in his first 2 games back from injury. And I saw a stat from Clev Analytics, I believe is the site, where Nick Chubb put up the highest rush yards over expected per attempt of any running back against the Ravens this season, this past week. So if you look at the raw numbers, it doesn't look like an impressive game, but it could signal better games for Chubb ahead, which would certainly help his volume, certainly help the offense overall. I just think there's not enough here for Elijah Moore to be supported. He's already disappointed us and disappointed the Jets to the point where, they knew their quarterbacks were bad and they were still like, we got to get rid of this wide receiver for whatever we can get. There will be some PPR occasions where he makes sense, but I think more likely he's going to be the guy that pops pops up here and there for a game without ever being a reliable fantasy asset. And I agree that I prefer Jerry Jeudy. And the next question is something I'm sure people are going to ask this week. Should I drop Jerry Jeudy because he was the number 3 performer among these Browns receivers in that game against Baltimore? So you already said that you prefer Jerry Jeudy to Elijah Moore still. Why is that?
Yeah, again, a lot of it's playing time. Jeudy actually ran a route on every single Jameis Winston drop back last week. Saw a 19.5% target share. If he stays in 19 to 20% target share range in this Jameis Winston offense, like Jerry Judy's going to have plenty of useful weeks. So he's definitely not a drop for me. And again, if he's available, Judy's just behind Tillman for me in terms of, how we value these guys going forward. With Elijah Moore, a pretty clear third for all the reasons you mentioned. I will say that's an interesting note on Chubb, who honestly has looked better than I thought he would in his second game. Just 2 games into his return, he's playing a bigger role than I thought he would. But the Browns, last week they were still plus 5% pass rate over expected. This has been a pass leaning offense all season. I think it will continue to be that. So again, that's the argument in favor of Elijah Moore, even if he is the 4th option in this passing game, which I think he will be more often than not. There could still be enough to make him a lower level option.
Now, people love asking the binary question, should I drop Jerry Jeudy? And the answer to questions like that, or any other name that you put in there, is rarely a simple yes or no, because if it's clearly yes or clearly no, then it's not a question you should be asking. So I think you always have to follow up with who would you be dropping him for? What else do you have at wide receiver? What's a scoring format? I certainly think that there are some teams that can afford to drop Jerry Jeudy. That he's not a must hold for everybody. If you have 4 wide receiver spots, then of course you don't need to cling to Jerry Jeudy. Would I drop him for Cedric Tillman if I had to decide between them? Yeah, I think so. I mean, Cedric Tillman, we don't know what the upside is yet. We've seen enough of Jerry Jeudy to know that we're probably not going to miss out on something special. So if I have to make that decision, I would I'd go Tillman, Jeudy, Elijah Moore. And so then the second part of that is, should I drop Jerry Jeudy for Elijah Moore? We already addressed that. The answer is no on that. And then, beyond that, there will be plenty other specific questions. That's exactly why we have the free agent finder built the way that it is, because you can look into it and say, hey, should I drop Jerry Jeudy for that guy? And you can sort by this week's projection. You can sort by next week's, rest of season, even ceiling, if you're just looking for pure ceiling value, and get the exact answer of what you should do with your roster.
The answer is always it depends. And the free agent finder is going to take into all those variables into the answer for you.
We talked about all of his wide receivers, Jared. So should we pick up Jameis Winston this week?
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases he's worth owning as a spot start option. Again, the issue is the schedule, second hardest remaining quarterback schedule. But the way he plays, the pass heaviness of this offense, like he's going to be volatile week to week. We just got a ceiling performance. We should note too with all these guys, this was a matchup that we loved for the Cleveland passing game against Baltimore. Pass funnel defense. They ended up being without 2 of their starting corners in that game last week. So it all kind of fell into place for the big Jameis game. I'm not expecting anything close to that on average going forward. Will he have more big games like that? Yeah, probably. So I think that makes him worth owning if you don't have like a locked in every week quarterback one.
Yeah. And obviously, again, it's going to depend on specific situations and formats and all that. I think 2 key things to know heading into, wondering whether you should pick up Jameis Winston, because you need to know more than just the numbers he put up against Baltimore. One, Jared, you said it, Baltimore's been a positive passing matchup. And I don't even think I realized how good a matchup it's been for QB scoring, or maybe even didn't trust it heading into this game. It's 5th best in the league on the season, according to our adjusted fantasy points allowed. They allowed 370 yards and 3 touchdowns to Baker Mayfield in week 7. They allowed Joe Burrow's best outing of the season so far, 392 and 5. They allowed Dak Prescott's best fantasy outing of the season weeks ago. And that remains his best outing by a wide margin. So it was a good matchup. We should keep that in mind for other quarterbacks that we're going to be talking about. And then Winston, even though he didn't throw an interception in this game, he had 3 turnover-worthy throws, which according to PFF matched Trevor Lawrence and Dak Prescott for highest on the week. So even when he avoids interceptions, a lot of times it's the defense helping him avoid interceptions. And, the key is we don't care as much about his INTs as we do the yardage and touchdowns. but they do still present some downside risk when, Kyle Hamilton decides to hang on to it.
I was going to say, he threw the ball right to Kyle Hamilton, a play or two before the touchdown to Cedric Tillman. So if Hamilton hangs on to that ball, we're talking about Jameis with, 280 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception, and we're probably not quite as excited about him.
Now, Winston, I don't think he's the most interesting name, but he's probably not the most interesting fantasy quarterback to talk about on waivers this week, because we also got big performances from Matthew Stafford and Bo Nix. They are both in our waiver pickups article. Jared, Stafford up first. What do you think about him, whether short term or the rest of the way?
As long as Matt Stafford has Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, like he's someone we can consider using as a spot starter in one quarterback leagues. I mean, Stafford finished quarterback 13 way back in week 1. He had Cooper Kupp for all that game and Puka for, I think, less than half of that game. He, finally gets those guys back this past Thursday night and finishes quarterback 6 against the Vikings defense that had been tough. Now, Stafford, kind of like Jameis Winston, Stafford has the 4th hardest remaining quarterback schedule according to our numbers. I look at the schedule, though, and I see plenty of usable spots, though. Starting this week against Seattle, New England week 11, Philadelphia week 12, New Orleans week 13, Arizona week 17. Like, I think those are all spots where even in one quarterback leagues, you can consider using Matt Stafford. So he's another guy. I actually probably slightly prefer Stafford to Winston the rest of the way, just looking at Stafford's weapons. Again, I think although the numbers say their schedules are pretty similar, I just look at the opponents and I think Stafford's schedule is a bit more doable.
I would also say that Stafford's a higher floor version of Jameis Winston. I don't think he brings nearly as much downside risk week to week as Winston does, and brings at least as much, I would say, upside as Winston does. So yeah, I would take Stafford over Winston. That said, it's easy right now to look at Stafford and say, yeah, he could be my quarterback the rest of the way. He also entered that Thursday game with 3 touchdown passes for the season and 7.0 yards per attempt. I know all of that was without Puka Nacua. Most of it was without Cooper Kupp, but we spent a lot of time last year waiting for Matthew Stafford to start throwing touchdown passes to match up with his yards. So we know that he's not a lock to give us numbers. There's that good matchup with Seattle this week, where if I'm looking for a week 9 quarterback, I think he's very interesting. There are usable spots beyond that, but like you said, it's not an overly attractive schedule. Yeah. So I'm not going out of my way to get Stafford this week. I prefer the next guy on the list, Bo Nix, and I wouldn't drop Stafford for a couple guys that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But up first is Bo Nix, who would have been a little higher in our week 8 rankings if I hadn't argued Jared down a bit on it, because Bo Nix had been producing fantasy numbers heading into last week. The passing yardage had not been at like the trustworthy level. And I guess I probably underrated the strength of his opponent in terms of how it was going to help his scoring, because Bo Nix exploded against the Panthers.
Yeah, that game was just as much about Carolina's defense as Bo Nix. I mean, I watched a lot of that one, and they're just receivers running wide open all over the field for Bo Nix. I still don't fully trust Nix. I'd probably have him behind Stafford and Winston, I think, although Nix has a much better schedule than those guys. The Broncos have the 4th easiest remaining quarterback schedule according to our numbers. That includes 4 games against bottom 9 quarterback defenses: Baltimore, Las Vegas, Indianapolis, and Cincinnati. So I don't know. I watched Denver games, and it's like I still don't think Nix is putting up the fantasy points he is, but the passing has been improving and the rushing has kind of been there all season, and we know how big rushing production is for quarterbacks. So I still don't trust it, but the numbers say that maybe Nick should be the top pickup among these 3 guys we've talked about.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say I fully trust him either. And I think probably fully trusting any rookie quarterback is not the way to go into it. It's more about taking what they do have. And although we haven't seen passing production that we can trust week to week, we have seen that Bo Nix has the rushing, which we expected going in, and he's not being sloppy with the ball. Like, I would have guessed he would be turning the ball over more. He only has 6 turnover-worthy throws all year. Compare that with the 3 that Jameis Winston had on Sunday. So Bo Nix is taking care of the ball pretty well. The passing stuff should keep getting better. Our boy Shane says it has gotten better. He's much more of a film grinder than I am, so I'm going to lean on him for that one. And, it just makes sense that the more time you get on an NFL field with your teammates, you should get more comfortable and better at operating the offense. So I think he's interesting going forward. Certainly don't fully trust him, but we get that matchup with Baltimore this week that we talked about. And, somebody already asked this morning on our Reddit, our subreddit, about whether they should, drop Caleb Williams for this list of quarterbacks. And my first reaction and seeing Bo Nix against Baltimore is I'm not sure if I trust Bo Nix this week against Baltimore, but then it's like, I wasn't sure last week whether I trusted Jameis Winston against Baltimore either. Like, this isn't a very good pass defense right now. So maybe we should go ahead and quote unquote trust Bo Nix this week, which would help him as a pickup.
Yeah. The scary thing this week, I think Denver had a 26-point implied total last week when the games kicked off on Sunday. It was like the third or fourth highest on the entire week. Denver's at 17.5 points implied this week, the second lowest. Only the Patriots are implied for fewer points this week. So that's kind of the warning sign if you're going to trust Nix too much this week.
Yeah, and of course, anytime I say trust, we're talking about, whether he's on the fringe of the top 12 or like QB 18, not talking about somebody that's going to be in my top 5. So that's this week's matchup, though. Next week against KC at KC, no thanks for me for Bo Nix in that one. But beyond that, nothing wrong with the following 3 matchups. Denver gets a week 14 bye. And then if he's playing well through that stretch, the fantasy season ends with a game against Indianapolis, a game at the Chargers, which is a matchup I would probably rather not go for. We'll see when we get to that point. But he also worked out as a fantasy quarterback in the first game against the Chargers without Denver scoring many points. And then they finish at the Bengals. So that's another positive matchup. I can't say right now that Bo Nix will even be an option in fantasy playoff time. He might not be playing well enough to even be in the discussion. But as of right now, if I'm weighing him against Caleb Williams, Geno Smith, Matthew Stafford, guys like that, there's a chance that Bo Nix is in the playoff discussion.
For sure. I think that schedule is one of the biggest things working in his favor alongside that rushing production.
I think Russell Wilson should be a quick one. He put up big numbers against the Jets. He put up okay numbers against the Giants, pretty good passing yardage in both games. But for me, he's not somebody that I'm really thinking about picking up off of waivers right now. What about you?
No, me either. Just a quarterback 2 option, I think. And listen, Wilson's played a lot better than I thought he was gonna. He's had 2 okay fantasy games. Well, the first one was really good. And last night against the Giants could have been good. He had some bad luck on plays called back by penalties and stuff. But he's playing pretty well. This is still a run-heavy Steelers offense. They've still been negative 7% pass rate over expected across Wilson's 2 starts. The weapons are still pretty iffy beyond George Pickens. So I'm not very excited about Wilson going forward, at least in one quarterback fantasy leagues.
The first bit of quarterback talk for me today was somebody asking on our subreddit if they should drop Caleb Williams for, several of the quarterbacks we talked about here. And, like I said, the question never really is as simple as should I drop or pick up this guy? Maybe. I'm not quitting on Caleb Williams just because of the clunker against Washington. We'll see. Like, Washington statistically looks like a negative matchup for quarterback scoring right now. I'm not sure how much I trust that at the moment, but maybe that proves true and helps explain why he had a bad week. Maybe it's just a rookie quarterback having a bad week. I'm at least trying to hold Caleb Williams through this week's matchup with Arizona. I can understand if somebody doesn't want to start him for that one. And, whether I would start him depends on who my other options are. But I would like to hold Caleb Williams through that game, because if he comes out and has the kind of fantasy outing he did in the previous 2 games, all of a sudden he's going to look like somebody that people want to pick up off of waivers next week.
Yeah, exactly. I think if you had asked a lot of people 3 days ago about Caleb, they would have said, this guy's a potential top 10 fantasy quarterback the rest of the way, because he had been trending up heading into that bye week. Over his previous 4 games, he had a 70% completion rate, 7.9 yards per attempt. Now, a lot of those were really good matchups. I do think Washington at this point is like at least a neutral matchup. They're not the pushover defense they were last year. If you look at what Caleb's done all season, he's been very matchup sensitive. He's been kind of predictable. He's delivered in good matchups and he's struggled in negative matchups. So that's kind of nice. It makes him, maybe more predictable as a start sit option. Look at the schedule going forward. He now has 8 straight neutral matchups according to our numbers. Not bottom 12 quarterback defenses, not top 12 quarterback defenses either. Just kind of a neutral schedule. He does get a plus matchup in week 17 against Seattle. So yeah, I would try to be holding Caleb at this point. See how he does in the next week or 2. If he continues to struggle, then maybe he's a drop. But I kind of like his chances to bounce back.
I wouldn't drop him this week for Matthew Stafford, because I think the ceiling is higher on Caleb Williams I guess I shouldn't say with the receivers, because Stafford's group is pretty good. But, he's got a great group of receivers with him. And then it's a coin flip for me on Caleb Williams versus Bo Nix. I have no idea who's going to be the better quarterback between them the rest of the way.
Yep, that's fair.
Geno Smith's the last guy, and the question is whether to drop him. I think he's in that kind of same boat for now, where I would prefer to hold him for now, at least through this week's matchup with the Rams ahead of the week 10 bye. And then if Geno Smith and or the offense stink for that game, then I'll be fine with dumping him in the bye week. But if he has a good fantasy outing there, then I would rather have him on my roster the rest of the way.
I would drop Caleb Williams before Geno Smith. I prefer Geno the rest of the way. Last week was not a surprise. Tough Bills pass defense without DK Metcalf. That was only Geno's third time this season, though, outside the top 12 fantasy quarterbacks. We've talked about the volume there. He's been giving us some rushing production. It sounds like DK Metcalf is going to be back this week. Pretty nice matchup against the Rams on Sunday. So I would definitely try to hang on to Geno. I even think he's a quarterback one option in fantasy lineups this week, assuming he gets DK Metcalf back.
And he has not had touchdown luck on his side. He has one game so far with more than one touchdown. So you mentioned the top 12 finishes. Fairly impressive when you're working on a 2.6% touchdown rate. He was low in touchdown rate last year too, but even that was 4%. And then it was 5.2% the year before that, his first full season as a starter. So there is significant positive regression potential in his touchdowns.
Exactly.
Let's move away from quarterbacks and two receivers. There's not a whole lot more to talk about, but a couple of names. Ricky Pearsall, what should I like about him coming out of week 8?
Yeah, I thought his week 8 was fine. Ran her out on 71% of the pass plays, 15% target share, had that impressive 39-yard run late in the game. We just have to see, though, what this wide receiver core looks like when Juwan Jennings gets back, which is expected to happen after this bye week. There's room for only one of these guys to be a fantasy option, right? As long as Deebo Samuel and George Kittle are healthy. So I think Pearsall's a solid hold. I think he's worth grabbing now if he's still available, because there is a chance he remains ahead of Juwan Jennings again. He is a first-round rookie. He is a guy who I think is a better approximation for what Brandon Ayuk did for this offense as a route runner, more of a downfield guy. Maybe he is the Ayuk replacement rather than Juwan Jennings. So hold Pearsall, and again, we'll kind of see what this wide receiver core looks like in week 10.
And of course, that Deebo Samuel is dealing with an injury, even if it's not something that's expected to keep him out for week 10, can only help with the upside for backup options in San Francisco. I like Jaguars wideout Parker Washington as a stash this week. I like him over Ricky Pearsall right now because of the immediacy. The 49ers are on bye, so we're going to have to wait at least until week 10 and probably beyond to see if Pearsall is going to give us something worthwhile. On the other hand, the Jaguars face Philly this week. They are 7.5 point underdogs, so probably going to be trailing in this. They're facing a defense that's playing well in the pass rush right now. We've got Brian Thomas Jr. and Gabe Davis both iffy. Travis Etienne still iffy. So a short range target who had a very useful game right after Christian Kirk went down last year could be an especially useful piece this week. He could come out of this weekend, with a strong PPR line. There's upside into the top 30 at least in PPR this week. And I think if we get that kind of game from Parker Washington, then we can decide how much of an asset he's going to be beyond that. Maybe in a deeper league, have somebody that's tradable.
Yeah, that's what I'd do. If Washington has a nice game this week, I'd be looking to sell him. I'm just not very excited about him as a longer term option for the rest of the season. I do expect him to pretty much fully take over Christian Kirk's slot role. He basically did that over the final 6 games of last season, though, and averaged just 3.5 targets, 2.7 catches, and 22 yards per game. Washington ran her out on 64% of the dropbacks over those 6 games. He should play a bit more, I think. Kirk was around 75-80% of the route, so you'll get a bit more playing time from Washington. He also has Brian Thomas on the field to compete for targets with, which he did not have last year. Plus, this Jags passing game is not one we've been, wanting to rely on too heavily. I could see it with Washington this week if Thomas is out, but beyond that, I'm not super excited about him.
Agreed. Long-term ceiling, not exciting. Week 9 ceiling, I think, intriguing. Finishing off with streaming defenses for week 9. I don't know about you, Jared, but I like the Bengals against the Raiders. 7.5 point favorites for Cincinnati. Yep. Raiders, 3 turnovers in 3 of the past 4 games, 5 straight games of 20 points scored or less, 4th most sacks allowed for the season. And the Bengals, to top it off, are coming off a lopsided home loss. So they're going to go into this game angry, probably try to jump out to a lead, and then just, put a stranglehold on the opponent.
Yeah, Bengals really safe bet this week. I think the Saints are a safe bet against Carolina. I honestly think, Bryce Young played one of his better games as a pro against Denver last week. We'll see Yeah, exactly. Not saying much. We'll see where it goes from there, but I'm still willing to bet against Bryce Young. I think Washington, though, is my favorite streaming defense this week. We kind of alluded to the fact they've just been playing better. They've only allowed 14.5 points per game over their last 4. They're averaging 3.3 sacks over that stretch. And this Giants offense is just a total mess. Like I'm not even sure Daniel Jones is going to make it through that entire Washington game. So I think the Commanders are a strong Week 9 spot starter.
We did at least finally see Daniel Jones yell at somebody the other night. I think that might have been the first time in his career. So it's nice to see that he has emotions.
Right.
Plus, he's playing at home, and we know that he has no idea how to find the end zone at home. So that can only help the Washington defense. Week 10, Jared, I checked on the Bears because I wondered if they were rostered at too high a rate to qualify, but they're just 39% rostered on Sleeper right now. They're at the Cardinals this week, which that's a matchup that could go either way, but we're looking at week 10 and the Bears are home for the Patriots. So if you're like unsure on whether to pick up the Bears this week, then go ahead and pick them up this week so you have them to face the Patriots in week 10.
Yeah, I mean, not a bad idea if you have space to just roster 2 defenses, even if you're not using the Bears this week, because in week 10, I would assume they're probably going to be our top ranked defense for that week. We've talked a lot about the Chargers. I think, they're probably my favorite streaming defense for week 10 against Tennessee. And even this week, I mean, they're playing against Jameis Winston. So again, we know there's upside to that matchup. So I wouldn't mind just having the Chargers for this week and next week. Beyond the Chargers, the Giants are the Bryce Young matchup, or I guess it might be back to Andy Dalton at that point. But either way, I think the Giants versus Carolina are an okay week 10 option.
Yeah, the Giants at the very least have done well in the pass rush, and Carolina is generous to opposing pass rushers. Of course, the question with all these defenses is whether they're available in your specific league, and you can use the free agent finder to quickly see if the Bears or Chargers or whatever defense you're looking for is available in any of your synced leagues. That is the cross league search feature. It's also a sneaky way to check real quick to see if there's this suddenly injured player, if you have him on any of your rosters and you need to make moves to make up for that. Because if you're like me, sometimes you're not really sure who you have across all the teams that you're trying to manage throughout the season. If you want to see more options and get bid recommendations for the week 9 waiver pickups, check our week 9 waiver pickups article. And if you play with IDPs, as you should, then we've got you covered on that front with an IDP version of that article as well. As always, we just want to be your unfair advantage.